Everybody's here on time. Don't forget to get on iClicker. Okay, so in Canvas, you have under, maybe it's in a folder, exam 3 material or whatever it's called. There's a number of lectures left. And I told you that next week, we just meet Tuesday. And so what we're going to try to finish up with is today. And today we're going to see what we can get. So there's a lecture on food webs, which we're going to start with today. I'll have chapter numbers from the days when we used the textbook. I think that might be 17. And then there's a chapter on ecosystem. And we're gonna see what we can get done from both of those. I might get to a slide and go, oh God, I don't want to do that. And since we're trying to do these 2 in one lecture, I might just tell you to ignore a slide. But we're going to do that today. So food webs and ecosystem ecology, they're both kind of part of the same thing. There's some redundancy there too, which is fun. And then next, I can't remember the order of things. Landscape ecology and succession, and a brief bit on global ecology. And there are PowerPoints for all of those things, hopefully in Canvas. So that's what we're going to tackle today. Just reminders. You have a Canvas assignment or participation. The assignment is described. It's worth 20 points in the syllabus, but I will grade it out of 30 so that you get 10 extra credit points. You do a really great job on it. It is asking you to do the same thing with OWL on campus that I asked you, a similar thing that I asked you to do with cats on campus. So so I've already started talking, having one-on-one meetings with people getting ready for exam 3, and pretty much across the board, people were thrown for a loop by that. 20 points. Paths on campus. What do you talk about it from the individual level? Talk about it from the population. So warning everyone, that is a bit of a curveball, but I think it's a really reasonable curveball to be able to talk human sentences about these levels of ecology. So you've got the cats under your belt, you've got the owls under your belt. Hopefully, I think that's due by the end of Friday. And that will show up again on exam 3. And I'm warning people that that will be an opportunity for me to press you on both the old stuff, so maybe individual population, species interaction, community. I guess community is kind of new stuff, and the newer stuff, community, ecosystem, landscape. And so in the exam 3 version of it, you'll be forced to talk about some of the newer levels, like the community level, or the ecosystem level, or the global level, or the landscape level. Okay, so that's the Canvas thing due by the end of Friday. I wanted to point out to you that we have 2 more 25-point quizzes. I don't have one ready today. Congratulations, or hurrah. But we'll need to do those. I think we only have 3 classes after today. Is that right? Yeah. So Tuesday, and not Thursday, and then the next Tuesday and Thursday. So anyway, we have 2 quizzes left, and we have 3 class sessions left. So if you do the math, there'll probably be some quizzes coming up. I want to remind you that in each of these quizzes and on the 3rd exam, you can use again one 8.5 by 11 cheat sheet. Go ahead and make one today during lecture as you're studying new stuff, or over the weekend in preparation for the possibility of a quiz. You can only use it if you have prepared it. If it were me, I would be making a sheet right now with mutualism and community and ecosystem and food webs in preparation for the next quiz. And then I would make a new one after that quiz is out of the way. And then I would make a totally new one for exam 3 based on what I think is most important to have there. So that's your fair warning that quizzes are coming, and you can use a sheet if you've got one. Final word is that a couple people still haven't made an appointment. If you were out, if you missed, the final reminder of this is that if you make an appointment with me by the end of this week, and we meet for half an hour, then you are eligible to take whatever exam 3 is that's better than exam 2 and have it count for exam 3 and also for exam 2. People that really struggle in exam 2 is a hugely generous offer. Won't you feel better if you improve exam 3 by 40 points? Exam 2 goes away. Unless you have a solid A in this class, I would say it's unless you did great on exam 2, it's an offer you shouldn't pass up. So please let me hear from you by email or Canvas or after class. And already set up with almost everybody. It's killing my schedule, but I've actually really enjoyed sitting down with those because I like to want to help make sure that you get a grade that you can live with. But I can only do that if you help me find the points for you. So get in touch with me if that is something you want to do. I think that's all of the announcements. Quizzes, Canvas, and exam 3. Any questions about that logistic stuff before we talk about ecosystem level ecology? Okay, and let me share what is called chapter 17 about food webs. This is pretty, I think this is pretty straightforward stuff. Sometimes people take this class and they're like, I didn't think it was going to be like that. I thought it was going to be what turns out to be ecosystem ecology. And that's because the little they treat ecology in high school tends to be like, save the tropical rainforest, kind of big ecosystem level stuff. And that turns out not to just be a small fraction of what ecology is. And it turns out that what you learn in high school is not really even what ecosystem ecology really is. It's much more abiotic kind of stuff. So I've reminded people already that, I mean, if you just can't get enough of ecosystem ecology, Becky Ball teaches a great class in it that you can take as an environmental science major or just for fun. So we have moved past the community level. The community is the last of the four levels over there on the right. We've now shifted to ecosystem ecology, which is then followed by the landscape and the region and the global level. So ecosystem ecology involves not just the organisms in the community, which is made up of a lot of species interactions, which is made up of a lot of populations, which are species, groups, subgroups of species, which are made up of a lot of individuals. We've now kind of done that, individual populations, species interactions, communities. Now we're ready to talk about how those living things interact in a big not living environment. So this is really more environmental ecology. And what I've really emphasized, because it's what I like more, and it's what I study, is organismal ecology. Okay, so that's the shift going on here from biotic to abiotic. And you're going to go, well, but like there's organisms in this too. Food webs, that must have organisms. Yes, they all spill over. There is no such thing as an environment without organisms. There's no such thing as an environment. Wait, I messed that up. There's no such thing as an environment that doesn't have organisms. And there's no such thing as an organism that doesn't have an environment. So you've got to embrace the overlap. So food webs are a really basic way that we talk about communities, and we put order into the community and then we turn it into this ecosystem. So food web is a good transition from community ecology to ecosystem ecology. Oh my God. Was somebody going to tell me that that wasn't on the board? You guys were going to let me go until I looked up there finally and saw. Okay, hold on. Guess you all should have stayed on Zoom. No source, that's the problem. Easily solved. This looked like I know something about computers. That would be false. Okay, so what did you guys not see? No, you just didn't see that. Food webs, putting order in communities. So a food web is as simple as it sounds, and we'll simplify it and then we'll make the point, wow, it can be not so simple. Here is a simple food chain. We'll call them food webs when we want to emphasize the complexity. But here you see a single chain from the primary producer. Also, decomposers can start the food chain as well. Plants, maybe a vulture eating a dead carcass on the side of the road. Feeding energy, sending energy to consumers. Obvious consumer would be an herbivore that eats the primary producer. But somebody eats this guy. Who eats deer? Maybe a mountain lion. Mountain lion would then be a secondary consumer, a consumer of a consumer. That primary consumer ate the producer. The primary consumer may or may not have consumers of it. And just to be thorough, we'll point out that some ecosystems can sustain a third level of consumer. Not many. I mean, I just showed you an example where mountain lion was a secondary consumer. Who eats a mountain lion? Maybe a human hunter, God forbid. Beautiful cat out there, just kill it. Probably doesn't even taste that good. But a tertiary consumer would have to be a predator of a predator who's a predator on this prey, right? Plant, herbivore, predator of herbivore, predator of the herbivore, okay? Notice that the arrows are headed up and that's because it's not talking about swooping down on the prey. It's talking about energy flow. And that's what we're moving towards in ecosystem ecology, is how does the food chain go? How does the energy flow through the ecosystem? Because it doesn't flow down. It starts here and then it moves up. And then it dissipates and then we lose it and there's no more ecosystem. So these are the links in the food chain. The food chain is the whole thing. The food web is just when we start realizing that more than this consumer eats this plant. Okay, so we're going to see food webs that are really complex, where there's like 19 herbivores, and then there's 5 predators of all those herbivores, and then there's one predator that eats those 5 predators that eat those 19 herbivores that eat those subset of plants. Simplified like this, it doesn't look like much of a web, does it? It's a link. It's a chain, I should say, and there are links in the chain. Each trophic level is, there are 5 trophic levels. Sorry, 4. The trophic level is the position in the food chain, and it determines the number of energy transfers that occur before it and occur after it. Okay, so a trophic level might be herbivore or primary consumer. Primary producer is a trophic level. Trophic, again, just means food. Okay, case studies. Case studies follow concepts and hopefully allow you to cement the concept in your mind and then have something to apply it with. And when you're studying for the exams, know the case studies for their own sake. I think there was a couple of questions on exam 2, like what was the primary case study used to display the idea of an organism's macro habitat? Geographic location. We talked about monarch butterflies. Now there's an eastern population and a western population. We talked about the selection pressures that shape that macro habitat, that geographic locale. Why aren't they in Florida? Why do they overwinter in Mexico? Why do you not mix the eastern and the western population? Aha, the Rocky Mountains. So you know the case study and know the concept that the case study shows, know the case study both for the kind of regurgitatable material, like what species did we use to display food webs? What community did we use to display food webs? And also the deeper material in it. So a case study for both community ecology and the ecosystem ecology that comes out of the community when we talk about energy flow is tropical pitcher plants. So pitcher plants we don't really have in temperate areas, so you're probably not, we certainly don't have them, I don't think, in deserts. But these are plants that hysterically have been shaped in ways that hold water. So I can't even imagine the individual level of natural selection going on to shape plants like this. We could only guess, but that would be a reasonable thing to ask you to, you know, there's pitcher plants, there's plants that are that collect water. Talk about the natural selection and the individual ecology that might have led to that. Our purposes here are surrounded by the fact that because there are pitcher plants, they actually collect water, and little replicate mini communities, aquatic communities, arise in each of these pitcher plants. Okay, we could have used anything. And I know people that study these communities, not by in temperate areas, not by looking at pitcher plants, but by putting old tires out in a forest. Old tires tend to collect water on the inside ring, and guess what? You get mosquito larvae, and then you get spiders, and then you get all kinds of you get a food web just by having a collection of water. Okay, so they're plants that are containers. It can also happen in tree holes or old tires if they're left out in the right way in a forest. Here are some pictures of some beautiful tropical pitcher plants that, I mean, they just look like natural selection was having a hilarious time designing them. But important for us is who lives in them. So don't get thrown here. The pitcher plant is just the container. We're primarily talking about who inhabits them. And they're inhabited by predators, and predators can't live without prey. I'm not sure why, but we've decided to go top down here. We start at the top. There are top level predators. These are again tertiary consumers, meaning that they are going to prey on somebody else that's also a consumer. The top level predators, the tertiary consumers in these food webs are tend to be spiders, spiders that hang out along the edge of the water. There's also some aquatic predators that prey on smaller, that are predators on smaller prey. There are intermediate level predators that take both secondary consumers. So is there a spider species that eats another spider species? But also most of them then taking the primary consumers. And these food webs are unique in that they are driven not just by primary production, not just by a plant housing them, but by the fact that this stale old water actually, this is the natural selection that people think pitcher plants are driven by, is that the water community attracts insects. The insects fall in there and decompose, and that is all of the good business. That's all of the good nutrient exchange that these plants need to grow. So there's primary production going on here, but the important base level of energy in the pitcher plant community is the decomposers that take, for example, flies that get in there and die, and then the organisms that decompose those nutrients are the base level of production. So we went backwards there a little bit. We could have started here and gone, pitcher plants attract these flies, flies fall in, they start to decompose, organisms help decompose them, they are the base level of energy. Who eats those decomposers? First level consumers. Who eats those first level consumers? Second level consumers. Is there anybody at the third level of consumption that eats the second level of consumption? And if you're really, really paying attention and you think, are there ever third level consumers that eat second level consumers and eat first level consumers? And is it possible for a third level consumer to eat second level and first level and to eat the plants or the decomposers? The answer is it's pretty rare. Pretty rare. Most organisms have a more specialized trophic niche than that. There are animals that kind of go side to side. We call that intra-guild predation. Say like predators that second level consumers that eat other second level consumers. So there's a little wiggle room there, but to simplify it, we generally talk about an organism filling one trophic niche, one part of the food web. So web, it hasn't looked like a web so far, but maybe this simplified example of the pitcher plant community will show you that it's a little more complicated than it first looks. So what's going on here? Primary producers at the bottom, in this case, it's decomposers. Each line is a trophic linkage. So this decomposer is feeding energy or being fed upon by, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 different species, 4 species of consumer. Sometimes that's a first level consumer. Sometimes it's actually a second level consumer that is eating or taking both first level consumer. Let's look at 7. It's feeding on 16, but it also sometimes just goes straight down and gets energy from the decomposers. So there is some wiggle room there. What else do we want to point out about this? We have decomposers, we have consumers of decomposers, we have predators of these consumers, and then we have predators of predators. So tertiary consumers, as we suggested before. Very rarely do you get anywhere past a tertiary consumer, and we'll talk about why that is. We're going to talk about a lot of things that come up in this, like connectants. Like, isn't it kind of interesting that this guy is so rarely fed upon? Like, the only organism that takes the energy from this decomposer is species 1. So this guy is pretty much like, if you were looking at like a social network, I don't know if you've ever looked at, diagrams of social networks, there are always like hubs. Sometimes they call them keystone individuals or keystone species. This guy doesn't seem to be much of a hub. Some people might say you could yank that out and the ecosystem would be pretty unaffected. That's kind of a quantitative way of thinking. If I'm not very connected and you take me out, I only have one connection, then that shouldn't be important. But that doesn't take into account the qualitative or kind of the keystone attributes there. What if this relationship is just incredibly important? What if you take that out and then one changes its behavior and starts eating in a different way? So we'll talk about connectance as we go forward too. But right now, just look at how it's pretty complex. I mean, this is a simple community, a little plant full of water with a couple of decomposers and consumers at 2 or 3 levels. Another thing we point out with this simple food web, which is also a community, the same thing as a community, except now we're emphasizing not just the diversity of species. Before we might have said 22 species or whatever that is. Now we're talking about the species interactions. So food webs are kind of taking communities and adding all of the diversity of species interactions to the community. And so we could talk about not the number of species, but the number of unique relationships between the species. We could focus on one species and go, okay, who is that important to? And we would find out almost everybody. Directly or indirectly, 18 is affecting every species in this community, except for the other 2 decomposers. And I would go further and say, that's actually not true. If you take this out and affect all of these species, well, these species affect this species. So if you go really indirect, you could say that, and you've maybe heard this before, you know, butterfly flaps its wings, that kind of thing. Everybody is affecting everybody in this food web, sometimes directly, like 6 feeding on 18, sometimes indirectly. 5 is eating 18. If you get rid of 18, 5 can't eat 18 anymore. Is 5 going to start eating 19 and 17? Remains to be seen. So recall this kind of resource / disturbance philosophical difference or different ways of approaching things. Bottom-up resources, top-down disturbance or predation approaches that we learned in the community ecology lecture. We want to kind of apply that to food webs for a second. And we want to talk about top-down webs. Some people call them source webs. I find it much easier to think of, to use the term top-down personally. If we were going to draw a web and we focused on 17, 17 is a resource, but the web that's being drawn is showing from top down who is a consumer of 17. We're focusing on 17, who consumes 17, and the answer is only one. That's a top-down web because we're looking up from the resource, asking who gets the energy from top-down consumption of this resource. We could do a top-down web on 6. Go, 6 is a resource. Who consumes it? And the answer is only 1, 4, and 2. In that respect, we could say, could we compare the top-down web of 6 and 16, we would find that many more species are affected by 16 from the top down than are affected by 6 as a resource. So a top-down web kind of lets you ask, what's the quality of this resource? What is the nature of the top-down consumption of that resource? So the focus in a top-down web is on who is consuming a resource, again, from the top down. We could switch gears and talk about a bottom-up web, some people call a sync web. A bottom-up web tells you to focus high. So this is one of those cases where maybe it helps to just remember it's the opposite of the way you would think it would be. A top-down web focuses low. Who's consuming that thing down there, that resource? A bottom-up web focuses high in the food web and says, in terms of the risk of being consumed. Where's the focus? So if we focus high on 3 in a bottom-up web, we say, well, who feeds 3? Well, 12 and 13 and 7 and 8. And then we're going to want to know who feeds on that. And so that would be 16. And we cascade down. So bottom-up webs are concerned with the consumer and its resources down at the bottom. Top-down webs are concerned with, focused on the resource and asking, as a resource, who do you provide energy for? If that seems like somebody named it backwards, you're probably not the first person to think that. Yeah.
Is it just direct and then?
Yeah, no, it's not just direct, and don't let this example fool you, because that's a unique example where there's only one consumer of 17. But here we have an example of 6. And also don't think that a top-down web has to go to the first level, because some organisms, get a lot of energy from middle level. Looks like 2 gets energy from here and then indirectly from here, but it also gets energy here. All it has to be a top-down web is focused on a resource and then asking who takes that resource from the top down. So don't get caught on direct and indirect, because you might say this is a direct feeding, but those are direct feedings too. But it can be much more complicated than that. That's bottom up. I guess maybe tell me if this is where you're coming from. The top-down web only talks about the direct impact of 6 on those consumers. But something happening to 4 is also going to affect 7 and 8. Is that what are you trying to distinguish that as, is it uniquely direct and not indirect? I guess I've actually never thought about it that way. But that top-down web doesn't have any of those indirect effects. And this bottom-up web has a number of indirect effects. But I think I've been teaching this class for like 12 years, and I've never actually really noticed that.
Oh. So bottom up.
Bottom up, because it's focusing up, I guess has more opportunity for indirect effects below. You're focusing on the top level consumer. You want to know what's 3's life like. And you're only going to know if you know what its resources are like from below. So the first thing you find out is the first level down. It's got 4 energy sources. And those energy sources are affected by who they can feed on. And so I actually think, and you guys would kill me if I asked this in an exam question. So very subtle, but Amber has just pointed out that bottom-up webs have more opportunity to learn about indirect effects. Can you think of a top-down web? Maybe we didn't pick a very good one. If we wanted to know a top-down web of 16, we're focused low, and what we learn is that everybody here is affected, and that everybody that feeds on those guys is affected. So I guess if I really stretch my imagination, you could find indirect effects from both. But these are really bad examples that don't have as many. Like 2 is not, what the hell's happening with 2? Nobody's eating 2. Seems unlikely. Seems like 2 would grow out of control. But in this depiction, 2 gets energy from 6, but is not controlled by anybody. 4 is fed on by 1. Of course, there's always the question of why do the top level predators not grow and grow and grow? And it's because of resource limitation. They don't have any clear predators, but they must be struggling to get enough food. So hopefully you're already asking yourself the question, why does the food web ever end? And notice how there's always fewer top level predators than intermediate level predators. and herbivores, why is it chunky in the middle? See how it's chunky in the middle? And that's a question that we're going to try to answer in a few slides. So I want to think about that a little bit more. Certainly the examples we've looked at here, there's more indirect effects focusing on bottom-up webs, but I think you could find those important indirect effects if you worked hard enough to pick different combinations here. Good question though. Here's another sync web, another bottom-up web. We're going to focus on 10. 10 happens to have no known consumers, but it is determined by this one resource. So we're going to focus high on 10, and we're going to try to understand what drives 10. Well, the primary production or decomposition of 18 is all that we can see in this food web that is determining the population growth of 10. So again, notice how some species are highly linked and some species are very lonely. And go back to our species interactions lesson. That lesson told us that you're more stable if your own population growth is determined by you and your K more than it is your competition coefficient or predation. We're going to take that to the community level, and we're going to say that if you're highly linked and communities that have lots of linkages are safer in terms of conservation, are more stable in their species diversity. Species that are out here all on their own, that looks like a pretty good life. No predators. But actually, there's great strength in having connections like this, because it means that, oh, you're being preyed upon by this guy, or you're being preyed upon by a bunch of guys. It looks like a tough life, but all of those linkages probably deflect an intense predation interaction with any one of them. So if you're thinking, if I were a prey species, would I rather have 20 predators or one predator? Probably 20, if that allowed you to deflect the intensity of any single relationship. So species interaction relationships are actually quite destabilizing when they're intense. And these food webs, especially when they're complex, they actually are known to support stability. So all of the doomsday ZGIs that we drew for intense predator-prey interactions, all of them are made much more stable when we add complexities, like we know how to do, prey density dependence, functional response, all the things that we know add stability in one-on-one species interaction. As soon as we take that and we put it in a community, everything gets happier. And you can still have species go extinct, but the complexity of having multiple interactions is very stabilizing. Okay, so a community food web is just the attempt to diagram all of the trophic relationships. It's an incomplete attempt, both because of a lack of having all the data, and also it's incomplete just because we would be overwhelmed if we tried to understand all of them. I mean, this would be a community food web of this very simplified community. And I mean, how many arrows are there? There's certainly more arrows than there are species, yes? Because some species have many, many arrows. So we're trying to understand food webs. That's the complexity of species interactions. And if we were going to do it for every interaction, that would be a community web, and that would end up being a little too much. Here is a more sophisticated or more realistic trophic food web, community food web, I should say. And, you know, it's, I can't even tell, probably 50 species in there. It's 49, about 50 species. My God, look at what 51. 51 must be exhausted. In this community, a lot of organisms are getting their energy from whoever this is. The point here is that this is pretty unrealistic to do this for most communities. It's out of control complex, although that's probably stabilizing in the chaos there. And even it is completely incomplete. It doesn't address the fact that species within the same trophic level or guild compete with each other, sometimes eat each other. Intraguild predation. Worse yet, none of these models addresses the thing that's most interesting to me, and that is predation within a species or cannibalism. So there's lots of complexity that doesn't go into this, and this is already overly complex. So we got to think about ways to simplify it a little bit. We've added all the trophic levels. We're looking at all the chains, all the links. We'd like to know how the diversity affects species interactions, or how the species interactions affects the diversity. But what we end up doing is having to really, really generalize. So that's why we started with species interactions, which were naively simplistic, but understandable almost. Now we're going whole hog the other direction and saying, well, what about all the species interactions? And there we learn, well, there's no computer model in the world that could handle or could reasonably predict things given all of this complexity. And so we want to try to simplify things. And that comes to the idea of connectance. In other words, even though we admit that species that have limited relationships might have really important relationships, oftentimes with a community web where there's hundreds and hundreds of arrows, we go to the species that have the most connectance. We go, rather than trying to understand all the pairwise interactions, we try to understand the ones that seem to be most impactful, quantitatively at least. Unless we know of a species that has a limited relationship and we know that it's really important, like Pisaster, or like the bunnies that graze and through intermediate disturbance maybe promote diversity. If we don't know that kind of specific detail, then we oftentimes focus on the species that are most connected. Somebody told you there's 100 species in this community and the community is threatened. Which ones should we preserve? You don't know any better. You might say, well, tell me who feeds the most and is fed upon the most. That's the one that is going to have the most ripple effects if it's not healthy. Okay, so connectance is simply a ratio, a percentage, however you want to look at it, the number of interactions that it actually has versus the potential. So the potential is going to be the total number of arrows in the denominator, and the numerator is going to be how many arrows are you actually involved in. So 6 has 1 from below and 3 from above. So 6 would have a 4 in the numerator. 16 has 1 and 2 from below, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 16 has a higher connectance, and no, I will not be asking math questions about this. I would be interested to see that you can look at a food web and see who is most connected. Interesting to note that in a lot of these, top level and bottom level are at a disadvantage. Right? We don't have the sunshine down here that has a linkage to the primary producer. By being at the top or the bottom level, you don't have the advantage of being able to get energy from an organism or and give energy to an organism. So it is true by definition that intermediate level organisms have more connectance than organisms at the bottom or the top. Except then we see those food webs where there's that one primary producer that everyone is involved with, in which case that would be a pretty connected species. The lower the value of connectance, like 6 versus 16, the less predictable. Like we don't know. It gets to not a quantitative relationship, but a qualitative relationship. This could be a really unique set of relationships we don't know. Just by quantity, we would say that 16 is more predictable and probably more important to conserve. Okay. Bringing up again the bottom up and top down contrast. High connectance food webs. Food webs, in other words, where the average amount of connectance is high. So we just talked about getting like the value for a species, but if you get the value for all the species, and then you average the connectance of species in a food web, if that's a high number, on average, everybody's connected a lot, then this is a food web that is going to be better explained by a bottom-up resource equilibrium approach. These are all kind of synonyms. That would be a great exam 3 question. Which of these are kind of synonyms for each other? Equilibrium, bottom-up, resource-based versus individualistic, top-down, non-equilibrium. Lottery hypothesis for community structure was one. Enemy release and resource abundance. These aren't synonyms, but they're all terms that are related to each other. So resource abundance, you hear, and hopefully you think bottom up. Enemy release, these are terms that actually came up in the invasive species literature. If we were to explain why an invasive species survives well or does well in a new environment, maybe it's because it has tons of resources in the new area. That's a bottom up equilibrium, resource abundance, resource niche, niche uniqueness kind of explanation. The explanation that an invasive species does well because there's no enemies in the new area, it's been released from its enemies. Hopefully you first see, okay, that's top down. The enemy, the exploiter, the predator, whatever, is being emphasized as being absent and therefore it's doing well. That's a top down non-equilibrium viewpoint of the community. Okay, so adding that connectance to that, high connectance, suggesting everybody is pretty well connected. That's kind of a equilibrium, resource-based view. You've got 22 species. Why do you have 22 species? Well, they're all pretty connected. So that's going to lead us to believe that it's about the resources and the equilibrium of the community. If you've got very little connectance, if everybody's pretty individualistic, another buzzword for low connectance, top-down thinking. If there's low connectance, then the number of species in the community is probably more about a top-down non-equilibrium viewpoint of community structure. One explains things from resource availability, the other explains things from disturbance. Okay. Kind of beating this dead horse. We not already said this? Oh, okay. Well, we talked about the food web being too complicated and too big. One way that you could simplify a food web is to really only focus, even like strip out species that don't have, that aren't heavily apparent. In other words, the abundance of a species. So if 2 is pretty rare, there aren't that many individuals of 2, maybe just drop that one out. That would be a way to emphasize only the abundant species. In contrast, if there are tons of 16, then maybe you've got to leave 16 in there. That's a quantitative approach to simplifying the food web. But the connectance viewpoint that we just went over suggests that it's less important how many there are and more important how connected they are. So what if there are lots of individual 2, the biomass is huge for the species, but if it's not affecting very many other species, then maybe that's a reason to leave it out. So which is more important, the biomass or the connectance? And the take-home message of the food web, kind of the lessons we've been learning from the qualitative impact, the keystone predator kind of thinking, the notion that predators can actually promote biodiversity, that qualitative instead of quantitative thinking suggests to most people in the modern day that the interaction, the quality of the interaction is more important than the sheer number of individuals. Sheer number of individuals could be about things like body size. It could be about things that are just unavoidable. But if you have lots of interactions, that tells us that you're very important to the community. Okay, so these are 2 different ways that you could go about emphasizing or even simplifying food webs. Most people, I think, would say that strength of interaction, connectance, is more important than just the numbers of individuals. abundance. Another way to do it, and these are all under the heading of how do we simplify community food webs? How could we possibly understand the community? One way is just to focus on dominant species. So this would be kind of an abundance approach. If it's a dominant species in that the biomass in that ecosystem is hugely dominated by one species, and sometimes we name ecosystems after these species. So the blue spruce ecosystem here, the creosote ecosystem, what is the most biomass represented species in a creosote flat? That would be creosote. If it's a dominant species, so dominant that it names the ecosystem, then maybe that is a really, really important species to feature. Again, that probably makes sense, but it's also an example of abundance thinking. If there's a lot of you, you must be really important in the community. Sometimes that's probably true. Sometimes it might be kind of false. Keystone species. So that's the quantitative approach. Now the qualitative approach, emphasizing that species can have an influence on community structure that's disproportionate to their biomass. We've looked at multiple examples. We looked at bunnies grazing in the chalk grasslands of England. We looked at pisaster feeding on an aquatic community. And we learned in both, and I think earlier we talked about sea otters and how they feed on kelp. In all of these examples, that arrow is a very deceptive thing because it suggests energy flow and it doesn't talk about the qualitative impact of that energy flow affecting other energy flows. So the qualitative approach, the keystone approach, emphasizes that the quality of the interaction is what determines the community structure more than just the quantity. There's a lot of you. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're shaping the community any more than a species that's rare, but has really, really important interactions. Okay, just making the point that these things are too complicated to deal with. Certainly for an empiricist, maybe a modeler could take a stab at that, but that's too complicated for an empiricist. If we just remove the weak feeding relationships, it could get more understandable. Right? It gets a little less chaotic. And then we want to wrap up talking about a couple of generalizations about food webs. First, again, focusing on the food web and the diversity of the interactions. The cycles that we saw in predator-prey or exploiter-exploitee relationships, the cycles being prey explode, predators grow too much, so prey start declining. That cycling, which was actually very destabilizing when we added something like time lags, the instability of cycling kind of goes away when we look at a diversity of interactions. In other words, if 13 and 16 have a predator-prey relationship and they create cycles for each other, the fact that 13 is being eaten by 3 and the fact that 13 is competing with 12 and 9 and 8 and 7 for 16, and the fact that 16 has to worry about all these guys, and the fact that 16 is actually getting resources from somebody else, that complexity dampens the instability and cycling in relationships. So that's just a way of specifically saying, the instability of cycles kind of goes away when we look at the complexity of community food webs. It's another reason to leave communities alone. Diverse communities, there are neat parallels here with the human community. Many people think a diverse human community, people with different perspectives, people with learning disorders, people from different racial or ethnic backgrounds, people that think differently, sometimes don't get along, but they sometimes come to the greatest conclusions. They sometimes, if they listen to each other, create the happiest outcome. Kind of it's a leap to make the parallels, but it's kind of a neat leap. In ecology, ecosystems with lots of diverse organisms, lots of different relationships, lots of different niches, create probably the most stable communities that we see. So we want lots of different things. We don't want a community that has all the same guy, all the same response. Second generalization about food webs, the number of predators or consumers generally goes up in regard to basal species as the diversity of the community increases. Okay, what are we trying to say here? Another way of saying this is that if you have a lot of species in your community, then you can support more consumers. Let's say that the opposite way to see if it makes more sense that way. If there aren't a lot of species, then you can't have a lot of consumers. And I don't mean biomass, I mean different species of consumers. You can only have a lot of consumers if you have a lot of species generally. And a good number of them have to be producers, right? So you only get second, third, God forbid, fourth level consumers if you've got a lot of species, if you've got a lot of diversity, species diversity. Species diversity, which we just hopefully just made a pitch for, solving world peace, solving ecological crises. Species diversity is good in a lot of reasons, and in one reason it's good is that it supports the consumers. Got to have a lot of species to have many consumers. I think we have an example of that. Oh, well, here's an example that you might be familiar with. If we're going to find a coyote, not the top level consumer, but probably a second level consumer, right? He eats a roadrunner. Roadrunner eats a lizard. Second or third level consumer, you'd probably be more likely to find that coyote, especially because there are a lot of places to hide here. There's also a lot of places for prey to live in here compared to here. So diverse communities, and you can see the plant diversity there, tend to harbor more top level consumers than the ecosystems that lack diversity. Here's a numerical example taken from marine communities. There's Pisaster up there. That's the one we know about. That Pisaster community is pretty species lacking. There's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 first level guys, and then 2 consumers, making the point you can't have a lot of consumers if you don't have lots of species in general. So the ratio there is 2 to 5. If we look at this community instead, probably twice as many species all together, and look at the ratio. Here the ratio is 2 consumers to 5 producers. Here you have more species that are consumers than that are producers. And that's because of all of these mid-level relationships, all the complexity in it. Complexity begets complexity. More species allows more species interactions. And this helps promote consumers, support consumers. This also is another way of saying that when you get species diversity, you get specialization. More species means more species interactions, means you get more unique relationships where you have a specialist that only feeds on a certain species, or a specialist with an amazing anti-predator adaptation aimed at one single species that probably historically was absolutely killing it. Third and fourth generalization about food webs. Contrary to intuition, food chain links do not differ greatly among ecosystems with different primary productivities. Okay, so first of all, food chain links, what does that mean? That means how many links are there? And everything we've looked at so far was producer, herbivore, predator of herbivore, and maybe predator of the herbivore. 4 levels. What that number 3 is saying is that, remember the pictures before, the creosote scrub and the riparian desert? Those are very different levels of productivity. One has water, one doesn't, basically because of the shape of the landscape. Those different productivities don't lead to different chain links. In other words, even in that creosote flat, you have the primary producer, creosote, you have the herbivore, whoever can tolerate eating creosote, it's pretty nasty stuff, and then the predator of that herbivore, and maybe a predator of that predator. 4 is about as high as we go, and the productivity of an ecosystem doesn't really determine doesn't create differences. You don't have 8 levels in a food web in a tropical rainforest just because there's more productivity. There are constraints on the chain lengths that we may or may not have time to talk about. Number 4, the only slight differences in chain lengths where consumers are vertebrates compared, there are only some chain lengths where consumers compared with where they are all invertebrates. What does that mean? There are only slight differences in chain lengths. Chain lengths, again, being how many links in the food web where consumers are vertebrates. Tell you what, I don't remember what I'm really going at there, so that probably won't be on the exam. My best guess is that it's saying that vertebrate consumers, which we know to take more energy to sustain, lead to not long chains versus invertebrate dominated, where the consumers are largely invertebrates, you can have longer chains. When the consumers are vertebrates, the chains really never go beyond 3 or 4 links. I'll have to review where I was going with that. Couple more. Chain lengths are smaller on small islands. Okay, if there's not a lot of territory, then you can't support a mountain lion. Okay, so you can't have a predator of a predator of a predator. In general, small areas support fewer top-level predators. Chains are shorter in areas that are disturbed. Okay, so think about urban Phoenix. Not too many mountain lions, maybe some coyotes. So we might have a predator of a herbivore, but in disturbed, heavily disturbed areas, you don't typically have predators of predators. You're asking why? If you're asking generally why, there are limited number of food levels. Let's go ahead and just put this idea out there because I don't think we're gonna have time to get to the notes on it. It comes back to the really laws of physics. If you start with a set amount of energy, you run out of energy after a number of energy transfers. Nutrients get recycled, but energy is constantly lost. Maybe you remember your laws of thermodynamics, but you cannot do anything but lose energy between links. The cheetah chases down a gazelle, there's energy lost. Yes, it eats that prey, that's consumed. The nutrients get recycled into the soil, but the energy is lost. As you go up food chain lengths, you get to the point where you're at a tertiary, top level, 4th level predator, and there's not enough energy. There's energy that it can take, but there's energy is being lost to the system. And of course, we wouldn't have life if there wasn't a regeneration of that energy. And that starts from primary production. So we wouldn't exist without primary producers that can start the energy chain by capturing sunlight. But once that energy flow gets shoved through the different systems, energy is lost, and then lost, and then lost until there's not enough to make another chain link. Chains are shorter in 2-dimensional habitats such as grasslands. Think about a desert, which is very open, or a grassland, which is very open, and compare it to a tropical rainforest where there's trees. There's entire ecosystems up in the treetops. These can support longer chains than 2-dimensional habitats. If you go out and up, you can have more 2nd, 3rd, and 4th level predators. Okay, this is just the summary slide. Accurate community web would include everything. That would oftentimes be too much. We've come down to the notion that we could emphasize the abundance of the members in the different species in the community, or we could really put our emphasis on the nature of the interaction. We focus on connectance and how connected you are in the community. That's featuring the importance of your interactions. If we just look at who is the most abundant species, then we wouldn't be taking into account the nature or the quality of the interactions. And God forbid that we ever make you solve a Locke-Volterra equation that has population growth for species 1 and its competitor species 2 and its predator and its mutualist, you can imagine how gnarly that would be to try to understand the true complexity of any species population growth based on all of the interactions that it has. Not to mention the interactions it has with abiotic factors like rainfall. But rainfall doesn't have population growth, so it wouldn't make it into here. Okay, we've got 13 minutes left, and I said there's a good bit of redundance between food webs and ecosystem ecology. So what I'm going to do is cut us off here. I kind of took the most important part of the ecosystem chapter, the idea that energy is lost as it gets transferred up into the system. That's like the founding notion for energy transfer and ecosystem ecology. There's all kinds of stuff about nutrients, nitrogen limitation, phosphorus limitation. I'm going to say if that's really the kind of stuff you love, then you got to go take Becky's class on ecosystem ecology. We will focus quiz and exam questions just on this lecture material. So that means the ecosystem ecology lecture that is on Canvas does not need to be your focus. We will start up on Tuesday with landscape, ecology, and succession. Then you'll go off for a wonderful Thanksgiving. And then we'll come back and finish up with global ecology. We'll aim to have our final lecture, which is 2 weeks from today. We'll aim for that to be a total review session. Reminder, be prepared for quizzes. Reminder to turn in your Canvas for by the end of Friday. And other than that, I'll give you 11 minutes of your life back.